Here at Bournemouth, every pre-clearing student gets guaranteed accommodation at one of our halls. However, if you also want to look at some other options instead, you can go for private accommodation. And in this video, I'm going to tell you some pros and cons and a few differences between BU accommodation and private. Some examples of the Bournemouth accommodation are Bailey Point, Dorchester House, Purbeck House, Lyme Regis and Cranbourne. But some examples of private accommodation are Lulworth, Bellerton, Skyline, Lansdowne Point, Artisan and St Peter's Hall. So in my first year I actually did stay in private accommodation. I could have gone for the BU ones, but because I got my UCAS application back in December, which was a whole 10 months before I started uni, I thought I'd use the time to look around at some other options. With the BU accommodation, you don't actually get to pick what halls you stay in until June, but with private accommodation you can do it at any point. Therefore, I ended up booking mine in the March, which for some people this can be a pro or a con. It meant I was prepared nice and early, but if something had gone wrong or I decided to pull out before joining university, I had no way to do so. Luckily that was fine because I'm still at Bournemouth 2 years later. Another advantage to private accommodation is you can live in it past your first year, so if you really enjoyed staying there you can always just rebook your spot. Whereas in the Bournemouth accommodation it is reserved only for first years, apart from a few circumstances. In some situations, private accommodation can be cheaper. It can also be more expensive. This is why I personally went for private, because at the time it was cheaper than some of the BU halls for what I got. For example, I got a double bed, but in a similar price to BU halls, I would have only had a single. However, some of the private accommodations were actually more expensive. You were looking £200 a week for some of them. However, they did come with some extra benefits, like one had a sky terrace, a few had gyms, mine had a basketball court. So you just really need to look at what you value in accommodation and go off of that. There was also quite a few negatives of living in private accommodation. I didn't get to choose my housemates, which was something that was quite intimidating, especially as I booked it so early. I got very lucky with my housemates actually, which was a blessing, but I appreciate that it could have gone quite badly. In the BU halls there is a separation between mature and non-mature students, whereas in private accommodation this isn't the case. So going in as someone who was freshly 18, I could have been living with someone much older, which would have been quite intimidating to some people, but as I said, luckily for me that wasn't the case. In a similar vein to that, private accommodation is a lot less secure. So for example, if you were to drop out of your course at university while in BU accommodation, it would have been easier for you to get out of your contract compared to staying in private accommodation, just because generally it's not associated with the university, so there's a lot less leeway. Another thing with private halls was that it was a mix of all the different universities. So there were 3 big universities in the local area. There was Bournemouth University, the Chiropractic Centre, which I think I just said wrong, and the Arts University Bournemouth. In private accommodation, anyone from all of these universities or local colleges can live in these halls. As long as you're a student, you can live in private accommodation. Whereas in the Bournemouth University accommodation, you have to be a Bournemouth University student. It's in the name. Something that's offered at BU accommodation that wouldn't be in private is Res Life. Res Life is a team at BU that organise social activities within your halls. This is something I unfortunately had to miss in first year because I wasn't in BU accommodation. There were some slight equivalents in my halls, like Donut Day, but from what I saw in Res Life, we did kind of miss out. Also, you don't get a bus pass included in your accommodation when you go private, whereas in Bournemouth accommodation, you can have it included. So if you're looking at the price, remember that there's that difference. Another point to think about is that the bus route goes around the BU accommodation. Some of the private halls are in that Lansdowne cluster, but there are a few that are in the town centre. For me, I got really lucky with my private accommodation and I'm actually really glad I chose it. I saved a lot of money, my housemates were lovely, but there were definitely some cons. For example, we had a very tiny laundry room, nowhere near big enough for 300 people, and we couldn't really complain to the university about this because the halls had nothing to do with the university. But at the end of the day, it's totally up to you. Hope this video helped you decide and gave you the opportunity to learn more about private versus Bournemouth accommodation.